After 40 years of hard labor, a retired father finally escaped the noise of the city and bought his dream cabin in Wyoming, but peace lasted only a week. His arrogant son-in-law called out of nowhere and said, "My parents are moving in with you. If you don't like it, come back to the city." That single sentence shattered everything he'd worked for. Pride-burned disbelief hit, and something inside him snapped, not with rage, but with the cold clarity of a man who's had enough. What he did next would change the family forever. Subscribe for more revenge stories like this, and comment what you'd do if it happened to you. He sat in the creaking wooden chair, the sound of the Wyoming wind, crawling through the pines like a whisper of old ghosts. 40 years of labor had built this silence. 40 years of sweat, calloused hands, and a back that cracked every morning like a dry branch. Every board in that cabin was a story. Every nail a reminder of a paycheck stretched too thin. He could still see the steel mill, the endless glow of molten iron, and the time clock that dictated his life for decades. 40 years of showing up before dawn, missing birthdays, missing holidays, missing his own youth so his family wouldn't have to miss a single thing. He remembered the lunches, bologna sandwiches on white bread, no mustard, just quick fuel between shifts. He remembered sitting in the corner of the break room counting the years until he could finally say, "I'm done." His coworkers had joked that retirement was a myth, that men like them worked until their hearts gave out. But he had fought for this place, this land, this quiet. When he first saw the cabin, it wasn't much more than a shell, rough timber, uneven floorboards, windows so small they made the sky look like a postcard. He rebuilt it with his own hands. No contractors, no help, just patience and the slow rhythm of hammer and nail. He thought of all the times he'd told himself it would be worth it. When his knees screamed under the weight of the steel beams, when his foreman barked orders at men half his age, when the snow leaked through his boots on night shifts. It would all be worth it someday. Someday he'd have his own corner of the world where no one could tell him what to do. He'd earned that dream inch by inch, paycheck by paycheck. Now that dream was being treated like an empty lot, something to be taken, traded, and repurposed. His son-in-law's voice replayed in his head. "My parents are moving in with you. If you don't like it, come back to the city." The arrogance of it made his chest tighten. That city, Denver, had taken everything from him, his lungs, his youth, his wife's peace. It was the last place he'd ever go back to. He had buried her there 6 years ago, under a gray sky that smelled like rain and exhaust. He left because every street corner whispered her name. He looked around the cabin, the stone fireplace he'd built by hand, the coffee table made from reclaimed oak, the rocking chair that still carried the shape of her body. The scent of pine and coffee lingered in the air, and for a moment he could almost hear her laugh. She used to tease him about the cabin. "You're building a kingdom of quiet," she'd said, "but will you know what to do with all that silence?" He smiled faintly. He'd learned what to do with it. Listen. The wind, the birds, the river. They didn't demand, they didn't judge, and they didn't steal. 40 years. He thought of every extra shift he'd taken when the kids were little, working Christmas Eve so they could wake up to presents under the tree. His son Michael had been too young to understand that every dollar came from a piece of his father's body being worn down. But the son-in-law Jason, that man had no excuse. He was old enough to know better. He'd seen sacrifice. He just didn't care. Jason had the tone of a man who believed kindness was weakness, who thought money made a man's worth. He married into the family with a handshake that squeezed too tight and a smile that never reached his eyes. From the start, he'd measured everything: gifts, favors, time. Even love to him was transactional. When the father gave them the down payment for their first house, Jason didn't say thank you. He said, "We'll pay you back eventually." Eventually never came. Now Jason wanted to plant his own parents in this cabin, like weeds choking out the peace that had taken a lifetime to grow. The thought made the father's stomach turn. He wasn't a violent man, never had been, but there was something raw in him now, something that stirred like an animal cornered for too long. He walked out to the porch. The mountains were painted in gold by the setting sun, and the air was sharp with pine and distance. He breathed it in slowly, the way a man breathes before making a decision he can't take back. His hands were rough but steady. He knew what needed to be done, just not how far he'd have to go. He picked up the old thermos from the railing, the same one he'd carried to work every day for 40 years. The metal was dented, but it still held heat. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, the bitter kind he liked, and stared out into the woods. Somewhere beyond the trees he could hear the faint trickle of the creek. It was the sound of time itself, slow, unstoppable, eroding everything in its path. He thought of calling his son, of explaining, of asking if this was really his idea, or if Jason had manipulated him again. But deep down he already knew the answer. His son had inherited his mother's soft heart too, forgiving, too easily swayed by guilt and obligation. The father had seen it happen before, when his son had given away money he didn't have just to keep the peace. It was a curse, that kind of kindness. He clenched his jaw. Maybe this was his fault too. Maybe he'd been too generous, too willing to sacrifice for others. He'd thought that was love. Now he saw it was permission for people to take and take until there was nothing left. The wind shifted colder now, carrying the faint scent of rain. He turned back toward the cabin, the porch light flickering to life on its own timer. Inside, the clock ticked softly. He had always liked that sound. It meant order, rhythm, the passage of time. But tonight it sounded like a countdown. He sat at the table and opened his old notebook, the one he used for repair plans and grocery lists. He drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left he wrote, "What they want." On the right, "What I have left." His pen hovered for a moment before he wrote the first word, peace. Then under it, freedom. Then finally, pride. He stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then he drew a heavy line through the first 2. Pride was the only thing they couldn't take unless he gave it away. A single lamp glowed in the corner, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. He knew a storm was coming, maybe from the sky, maybe from the people he once called family. Either way, he was ready. When the first drops of rain hit the roof, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was resolve, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be dangerous. He closed the notebook, took one last look at the picture of his wife on the mantel, and whispered, "You were right, sweetheart. Silence doesn't mean peace. It means preparation." He leaned back in his chair as the thunder deepened. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one he was about to unleash. And when it arrived, no one, not Jason, not his son, not anyone, would ever forget it. The line hit him like a slap. "You should have stayed in Denver." It wasn't just arrogance, it was dismissal. A sentence that erased 40 years of work, 40 years of survival. He replayed it in his mind as he sat at the small table, the one he had built from walnut and varnished with his own hands. Outside, the rain had thickened, striking the cabin roof in steady rhythm. Inside, his coffee had gone cold, untouched since that call. He stared at it as if the dark surface might tell him how to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. There was only what came next. His silence wasn't weakness. It was containment. Every insult, every betrayal in his life had gone the same way. People mistook his quiet for surrender. They never understood what silence could hold, the slow build of something sharp and deliberate. He'd learned that from the mill. Steel didn't scream while it was forged. It just endured the heat until it became unbreakable. He stood up his chair, scraping against the floorboards, and walked to the window. The world outside looked washed in silver, the pine trees dripping with rain, the dirt path slick and dark. Denver. That word meant confinement. He could still see the cramped apartment, the smell of exhaust, the endless traffic. His son-in-law's words didn't just insult him. They reminded him of everything he'd escaped. And now that man wanted to drag his peace back into the noise. He could almost hear his wife's voice, the one that always calmed him when the world turned cruel. "Don't waste breath on people who don't listen," she used to say. "Show them." She had been the gentler one, but even she had understood the power of action over argument. He missed that wisdom. He missed her. And in that ache, something solidified a decision. He turned from the window, took the receiver from the wall phone, and set it down gently. His son would call again. Maybe apologize, maybe try to explain. But explanations were like perfume, they covered the rot without removing it. He wasn't interested in words anymore. He began pacing each step, measured his mind, clearing with every breath. Jason's arrogance wasn't new. There had been signs the way he'd dismissed every gift, every offer, every story from the past, as if none of it mattered. But this time was different. This was intrusion. This was violation. The cabin was more than property. It was the last piece of himself that hadn't been taken or traded, and that made it sacred. He moved toward the fireplace. On the mantel sat the photograph of his son's wedding. He picked it up. Jason's grin looked smug, even frozen in glossy paper. His son Michael stood beside him, smiling with that same uncertain politeness he'd worn his entire life, the kind that tried to keep everyone happy. He traced a thumb over Michael's face. Somewhere beneath all the manipulation, his son was still in there, a good man who had forgotten how to say no. He placed the photo down face first, not out of hate but out of focus. He needed clarity, and the past always blurred it. The next morning he woke before dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. He stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the early light. The forest was quiet except for a single hawk circling overhead. He'd always admired hawks' silent watchers who struck only when necessary. He wanted to be that way again. He took his truck down the narrow road into town. It wasn't much of a town, just a gas station, a diner, and a hardware store that doubled as the post office. He bought supplies, locks, motion lights, extra cameras, lumber, and a pad of graph paper. When the cashier, an older man with a long beard, asked if he was building something, he smiled faintly and said, "Just reinforcing what's already mine." Back at the cabin, he worked methodically. The new locks clicked into place on every door. The cameras went up under the eaves disguised beneath wood trim. Every wire was tucked, every screw tightened. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Jason would call it overreaction, but Jason didn't understand that peace without defense was just a delay before loss. By midday, he stopped for lunch soup from a can warmed on the stove. As he ate, he glanced at the notebook from the night before. The words peace, freedom, pride still glared up at him. He added a fourth: boundaries. He underlined it twice. The phone rang once that afternoon. He didn't answer. Let them wonder. Silence was a language they didn't know how to read. That evening he sat on the porch again, watching the sun melt into the horizon. He thought of his son as a boy, barefoot in the backyard building forts from scrap wood, asking endless questions. He'd loved that curiosity, that innocence. Somewhere along the way, Jason had drained it out of him, replacing wonder with compliance. But men didn't stay lost forever. The truth had a way of circling back sharp as winter air. The next day, a truck rolled up the gravel path, Jason's, of course. The father stayed seated, the rocking chair steady beneath him. Jason stepped out, sunglasses on, posture oozing entitlement. "Didn't think I'd find you here," he said. "Phone's been off." The father said nothing. Jason smirked. "You didn't take that seriously, did you, about my parents moving in?" "It's happening. End of discussion." Still silence. The rocking continued, slow and deliberate. Jason's smirk faltered. "You can't just sit there and ignore me," he snapped. The father finally looked up. "Watch me." Something flickered in Jason's face. Uncertainty. He wasn't used to resistance. "Look," Jason said, lowering his tone. "It's not personal. You don't need all this space. It's just practical." "Practical," the father repeated. The word tasted like rust. He stood slowly, his height still enough to make Jason step back. "You mistake patience for permission. I've been quiet because I believed in family. That was my mistake." Jason tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow. "You're overreacting." "This is overreacting," the father cut in, voice calm but edged. "That's what men like you say when someone finally tells you no." Jason's expression hardened. "You don't scare me." "Good," the father said. "I'm not trying to." He stepped past him, walked to the truck and pulled the keys from the ignition before tossing them onto the dirt. "You'll walk back. Clears the head." Jason's face flushed red, but he said nothing. The father went back to his porch and sat again. The rocking resumed steady as a heartbeat. By the time Jason disappeared down the road, the sun had set. The father exhaled slowly. The anger hadn't left him, it had just changed shape. It wasn't fire anymore, it was iron. Controlled, cold, unyielding. He knew Jason wouldn't give up. He'd be back maybe with his son, maybe with paperwork, maybe with something uglier. But that was fine. Let them come. The cabin wasn't just his home, it was his line in the sand. He picked up his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote 2 words under the last list, Phase 1. Then he drew a small square at the bottom and labeled it Jason's lesson. Outside, the forest hummed under the night sky, alive but watching. Somewhere deep in those woods, something moved, a reminder that in nature, boundaries were respected only once they were enforced. And he was ready to enforce them. He didn't yell. He never had. That was Jason's mistake, thinking volume meant power. The father had learned long ago that real strength was measured in precision. While others shouted, he calculated. While others struck blindly, he built blueprints. That night, long after Jason's truck vanished down the road, he sat at his kitchen table beneath the low hum of the single overhead bulb, a pencil in his hand, the old engineer's habit returning like muscle memory. He pulled a sheet of graph paper from his notebook and drew the outline of his cabin, every wall, every window, every entry point. Then he marked weaknesses. 2 ground-level windows that opened too easily. The side path that wasn't covered by the motion sensors. The storage shed without a lock. To anyone else, it would look like a security plan. To him, it was a schematic of control. The kind of plan you made when you'd been pushed too far and wanted to make sure you'd never be pushed again. By midnight, the table was covered with sketches, lists, and calculations. He worked methodically, sharpening his pencil between thoughts. Step 1, reinforce. Step 2, observe. Step 3, neutralize. The order mattered. He approached it the way he had approached bridges back in his working days, measure twice. Act once, leave no room for failure. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping branches and distant thunder. He rose from the table, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and studied the sketches. It was a strange kind of peace, knowing what came next. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by structure. Every problem could be solved with the right design, and this was no different. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. The next morning he drove to town again, but this time he didn't stop at the hardware store. He went farther, to the industrial supply depot on the edge of the county, the kind of place where old foremen still recognized his face. The clerk, a heavyset man named Ralph, looked up and smiled. "Haven't seen you since you retired, Rick. What brings you in?" "Working on a project," he said simply. "Need pressure sensors, a few relays, and some heavy-duty wire." Ralph chuckled. "Building another invention, huh?" "Something like that." When he returned home, the woods were thick with mist. He carried the boxes into the shed, cleared the workbench, and began assembling his design. Wires spread like veins across the wood. Circuits clicked into place. He wasn't building a trap, not exactly. He was building a message. Every man had his language, and his was electricity and logic. By sundown, the first system was ready. A low-voltage network that connected the perimeter to an alarm he could control from inside. If anyone stepped onto his property uninvited, he'd know before they reached the porch. It wasn't about fear, it was about control. Jason thrived on catching people off guard. That wouldn't happen again. He tested the sensors one by one, walking the boundary with careful steps. Each beep from the control panel was satisfying, steady, precise. When he was done, he stood in the middle of his land, hands on his hips, looking at what he had built. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the mountains stood like silent witnesses. For the first time in weeks, he felt calm. That calm was dangerous, though. It wasn't peace, it was the quiet that comes before a deliberate storm. The next few days passed with mechanical rhythm. Morning coffee, check the perimeter, adjust the wiring, note any vehicles on the distant road. He installed small cameras in the trees, blending them into the bark with brown spray paint. He ran a hidden cable from the porch to the woodshed, connecting it to an old generator he kept for emergencies. If the power ever went out, he could still see, still hear, still know. At night, he reviewed footage on his laptop, a habit that became almost meditative. The screen showed only shadows and motion, foxes, deer, the occasional storm of wind through the branches. But on the fourth night, there was something else. Headlights on the road. A car slowing near his driveway, then backing away. Too far to make out who it was, but he didn't need to guess. He closed the laptop and leaned back, his face calm, but his pulse steady as a metronome. He had expected this. Jason was testing him, seeing if the old man would break. But this time, the old man wasn't the one being tested. The following morning, he began his second project, the mechanical one. He brought out the old woodworking tools from the shed, the ones he hadn't touched since his wife died. He sanded planks until they were smooth as glass, measured cuts with surgical precision, and began building something that didn't yet have a name. A large box reinforced with hinges that clicked shut like a vault. He installed a remote latch inside, hidden under a false panel. It wasn't meant to trap anyone forever, just long enough to make a point. By the third evening, it stood finished in the corner of the shed, stained dark and polished. He stared at it for a long time, remembering the bridges he used to build, structures designed to carry others safely across. Funny, he thought, how his work had come full circle. He was still building bridges, just not the kind that saved people. The next call came on a Thursday. His son, this time, not Jason. The tone was soft, apologetic. "Dad, can we talk?" He said nothing for a long moment. "If it's about the cabin, don't bother." Jason didn't mean to sound harsh, his son began. He just, "Stop." His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "You think harsh words are the problem? They're not. The problem is that you think what's mine is negotiable. Dad, it's just a house." He almost laughed, but it came out more like a breath. "If that's what you think, then you've already lost more than you know." He hung up before his son could reply. Then he stood there for a while, staring at the silent phone, feeling the weight of what that call had truly confirmed. He was alone now, not by circumstance, but by choice. And that was fine. Solitude wasn't a punishment when it came with self-respect. That night the generator kicked on as the storm rolled in. He sat by the fire, the glow of the flames painting his face in amber and shadow. Outside, the cameras blinked red in the rain. He sipped his bourbon, slow and deliberate, and opened his notebook again. He wrote across the page in steady block letters, "Predict, prevent, protect," then underlined each one. He didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. What he needed was mastery, proof that control still belonged to him, not the vultures circling around his life. When lightning cracked across the valley, illuminating the trees in brief flashes, he didn't flinch. He simply smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. Because some storms don't destroy. They cleanse. And this one had only just begun. He began with the sound. The wolves. At night, when the wind crawled through the timberline, their howls rolled over the valley like a low hymn, distant but deliberate. Most men found it unsettling. He found it grounding. Nature didn't beg, it didn't ask, it took balance back by force. That was something he understood better than most. For weeks he'd watched their trails through the snow, track their prints, learn their rhythm. He wasn't afraid. The cabin sat on the edge of 1,000 untamed acres, and for the first time, that wildness didn't feel like danger. It felt like company. He started studying them the way he used to study engineering schematics, meticulous, detail by detail. Wolves never wasted movement. They never attacked without purpose. They didn't destroy what they didn't need. They watched, tested, waited, and struck with precision when the moment came. It wasn't cruelty, it was equilibrium. The world called them predators. He saw them as architects. In the mornings he read about them. He ordered old field manuals and ranger reports online underlining passages about pack hierarchies, hunting patterns, territorial instincts. He learned their boundaries stretched wide but never aimless. They respected what they claimed and punished those who didn't. That he thought was nature's law, a lesson his son-in-law had never learned. By the end of the week he began his experiment. Not a trap, not violence, just demonstration. He gathered raw meat from the butcher in town, scraps, bones, things no one wanted. When the young clerk asked what for, he said, "For the neighbors." The boy laughed, not realizing how true it was. At dusk he carried the bag out into the woods. The air was sharp, the kind that sliced through your lungs when you breathed too deep. He moved quietly, deliberate steps crunching over frost and pine needles. He stopped by the old fence line, the one that marked where his land ended and wilderness began. He scattered the meat in a wide semicircle and stood still, listening. The forest held its breath. Then he turned and walked back without looking over his shoulder. The next morning the ground was disturbed. Paw prints, at least 5 different sets, circled where he had stood. The meat was gone. He crouched and traced the largest print with his gloved finger, feeling the depth in the snow. Heavy, strong, a full-grown alpha, maybe 100 pounds of muscle and instinct. He smiled faintly. Nature had accepted the offering. He repeated the ritual over the next few nights, each time pushing a little closer to the cabin, narrowing the circle. He wanted the scent to linger, to remind anyone who stepped foot here that this place didn't belong to them. It belonged to balance. Jason would never understand it. Men like him thought civilization made them untouchable, that laws and property deeds meant control. But nature didn't care about paperwork. The father wasn't summoning the wolves. He was reminding the world what happens when you trespass where you don't belong. By the 3rd week the pattern was clear. He'd hear them before dawn, their calls closer now, echoing through the trees like living thunder. He'd sit on the porch with his coffee and listen, not afraid, not anxious, just present. It was strange how peace and power could sound the same when you stopped running from either. Then one evening headlights cut through the trees. Jason's truck again. The father didn't move. He stayed seated, the wolves' chorus still faint in the distance. The younger man climbed out, stomping through the gravel, his city boots slipping on the damp earth. "We need to talk," Jason said, his voice loud, commanding, as if volume could drown out the night. The father didn't answer. Jason took another step. "You're being unreasonable," he said. "You think this is some game? You're scaring everyone." The father's eyes shifted toward the tree line. "Not everyone." A sound rose from the woods, a long, hollow howl that rippled through the valley. Jason froze, his confidence cracking for the first time. The father watched his reaction, calm and unblinking. Another howl followed, closer this time, then another, layered and resonant. Jason turned, scanning the dark. "What the hell is that?" "Neighbors," the father said, voice even. Jason took a step back. "You did this?" "I didn't do anything," he replied. "I just stopped pretending we're the only ones who live here." For a moment neither spoke. The wind shifted, carrying a scent, earth rain, something faintly metallic. Jason's eyes darted toward the sound of movement beyond the fence line. A shape flickered between trees, low and fluid. Then another. He couldn't tell how many. The father leaned forward in his chair. "You know what wolves do when someone wanders into their territory?" he asked quietly. "They don't shout. They don't warn. They let the silence speak first." Jason swallowed, forcing a smirk. "You're out of your mind," maybe the father said. "But even madness deserves its space." He stood, and Jason instinctively took a step back toward the truck. The howls faded, replaced by the steady drip of melting snow. The father stopped at the porch rail, his silhouette framed in the porch light. "Go home, Jason," he said softly. "Tell your parents this place isn't safe for guests." Jason hesitated, trying to find words, but the woods around them seemed to close in branches, creaking unseen footsteps shifting in the underbrush. Finally, he turned and climbed into the truck. Gravel spat under his tires as he sped away, taillights vanishing into the dark. The father stood there long after the sound faded. The woods returned to stillness, save for the faint rustle of fur brushing against bark somewhere unseen. He exhaled slowly, the air fogging in front of him. He hadn't summoned violence. He'd simply invited truth. Over the next few nights, the wolves kept their distance as if satisfied with their reminder. He respected that. Every boundary needs acknowledgement, not domination. He walked the perimeter one last time, noting the faint impressions of paws near the fence. The lesson had landed: nature never negotiates, it corrects. He returned to the cabin, his boots heavy with mud. The moonlight caught the reflection of the fence gleaming like silver wire. Inside, he poured himself a bourbon and sat at the table, his pencil tapping against the notebook. He added one new word to his list beneath the others: harmony. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. Not the quiet kind that hides weakness, but the earned kind, born from action. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to threaten. The wilderness had spoken for him. But even as the calm settled in, he knew this wasn't over. Men like Jason didn't learn from warnings. They mistook mercy for surrender. And when he inevitably returned, the father would be ready with a different kind of lesson, one the wolves had taught him well. Patience before precision, silence before strike, balance before justice. And this time, there would be no echoes, only consequence. The headlights came first, two pale beams trembling across the dirt road, cutting through the mist that hung low over the trees. The father stood by the window, the reflection of his own face hovering ghost-like against the glass. It was them, Jason's parents, the uninvited guests, the ones who thought the cabin in the woods was theirs to inherit through arrogance and convenience. He didn't move. He just watched the car pull to a stop near the porch, tires sinking into the wet gravel, the engine humming before falling silent. The doors opened. A man and woman stepped out, Gerald and Patricia, both dressed like tourists rather than settlers. Gerald wore a quilted jacket, his hands in fine leather gloves, his posture that of a man accustomed to ordering, not asking. Patricia clutched her designer handbag like a shield, scanning the trees with restless eyes. The silence unnerved them. It always did. Inside the cabin, the father sipped his coffee, dark and steady. On the laptop in front of him, 4 small windows displayed grainy black and white footage from the cameras he had installed around the property. Each angle caught a different truth: the long stretch of fence, the porch, the edge of the woods where the tree line breathed. The sensors had already detected movement before the car arrived. They weren't alone. He clicked one window larger. In the distance, just beyond the curve of the driveway, shadows shifted. Not men. Wolves. The pack had arrived earlier than expected, drawn by the scent he had left days before. He hadn't needed to call them. They knew their rhythm now, their pattern synchronized with his. Outside, Gerald was muttering something about the cold, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. Patricia complained about cell service. No signal, she said, waving her phone as if that could summon it. Jason said this place had Wi-Fi. The father smiled faintly. Jason said a lot of things. The wolves emerged without sound, only motion, the low glide of bodies through the snow eyes catching light like embers. The couple froze. Gerald blinked hard, squinting into the dark. What the hell did you see? That Patricia followed his gaze, and when she did, the scream came high, startled, unrestrained. The father didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. On the screen, one of the wolves stepped fully into the light. It was magnificent gray coat, dusted with frost, chest broad, posture regal. It wasn't attacking. It was watching, assessing. The pack spread behind it, silent, disciplined. Perfect. Gerald fumbled for the car keys. His hands shook. "Get in," he said sharply. "Now!" But the remote lock clicked uselessly, frozen, jammed from the cold. Patricia stumbled toward the passenger side, her heels sinking into the mud. "They're coming closer," she whispered, voice cracking. The father took another sip of coffee, his gaze fixed on the screen. He didn't take joy in fear, not exactly. What he felt was something colder and cleaner justice. Not delivered by human hands, but by balance itself. The same nature they thought of as scenery was reminding them who ruled here. Gerald grabbed a stick from near the porch, waving it uselessly. "Go on," he shouted toward the tree line. His voice carried desperate and shaky. The wolves didn't retreat. One tilted its head slightly as if curious, then took a step forward. Another followed. Patricia was crying now, her voice trembling. "Why are they just standing there?" "Because they're not afraid," the father thought. "Because you don't belong here." He adjusted the laptop angle to capture the full scene. He didn't plan to show anyone this, but he wanted the record. Proof of how quickly power shifts when arrogance meets wilderness. Then the motion lights flickered on, flooding the yard with pale light. The wolves hesitated for only a moment before scattering into the shadows. Their silhouettes vanished between the trees as quickly as they had appeared. The forest swallowed them whole again. Silence fell heavy, punctuated only by Patricia's ragged breathing. The father exhaled slowly. He set the mug down, the clink of ceramic echoing softly in the room. On the screen, Gerald stood frozen by the car door, his pride deflated, his coat smeared with mud. Patricia leaned against the vehicle, shaking. The father closed the laptop and walked to the window. Through the glass he could see the fear that now lived in their posture, their hands fumbling with keys, their eyes darting toward every shadow. They no longer looked like intruders. They looked like children who had wandered somewhere they didn't understand. When the car finally started, its engine roared too loud for the quiet woods. The headlights swung wildly as Gerald reversed too fast, scraping the side mirror against a post. Then the car lurched down the road, disappearing into the darkness from which it came. He stood there for a long time after they were gone. The forest slowly reclaimed its rhythm, the drip of melting snow, the whisper of branches, the faint distant howl from deep within the valley. Not angry, not warning, simply present. He walked to the table and sat down again, the fire crackling low in the hearth. He picked up the pencil beside his notebook and drew a single line across the page beneath the word harmony. Then he wrote, "Lesson delivered." It wasn't vengeance. It was equilibrium. Nature had a way of doing what men refused to. It corrected arrogance with awe. Later that night, as the wind shifted, he replayed the footage once more. Not out of cruelty, but out of fascination. Watching the wolves move was like watching water find its course, inevitable, fluid, unstoppable. He paused the frame where the lead wolf stared straight into the camera. For a moment it felt like it was looking back at him. "You and me both," he murmured. He shut the laptop and let the quiet settle. He had no illusions that this was the end. Jason would hear about what happened, twisted, exaggerated, spun into another attempt at control. But fear has its own gravity. The woods had left their mark on those who didn't belong. He poured one last drink and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting his throat. The moon hung low, fat and bright, casting a silver sheen across the frozen ground. He could still see the faint outlines of tracks near the fence, a wild signature left behind. Some lessons needed no words, no weapons, no witness. Just presence. He raised the glass slightly toward the woods, a quiet toast. "To balance," he said under his breath. From somewhere deep beyond the ridge, a single wolf answered its call, rolling through the valley like a promise. And as he stood there smiling faintly into the night, he knew the real storm hadn't even begun. It began quietly, as all poisons do. A few missed calls, a few strange silences on the other end of the line. Then came the messages trickling in from cousins, old friends, neighbors who never called unless something was wrong. "Are you doing okay out there? Heard you've been having trouble. Jason says you're not yourself lately." At first he dismissed them. Rumors travel fast in small towns. But by the third call the tone had shifted. Pity, concern. The kind reserved for someone fragile, someone slipping. He knew exactly where it came from. Jason. The man couldn't stand being humiliated, not after that night with the wolves. Pride doesn't die quietly, it claws for air. So he retaliated the only way weak men know how, through gossip. Whisper campaigns dressed as sympathy. Lies told with a furrowed brow and a hand on the shoulder. "He's not well," Jason must have said. "He's been confused lately, paranoid, isolating himself." The father's name became a diagnosis. His solitude, once his sanctuary, was now proof of instability. The cabin, his labor of love, was recast as a symptom. "He's hiding out there," they whispered. "He refuses to talk to anyone. He's obsessed with the woods." He tried to ignore it. For a while he did. He kept busy fixing the roof, cutting wood, checking the perimeter cameras. But every task began to feel heavier, as if the weight of their judgment pressed down through the air itself. When he went into town, conversations cut short as he entered. People nodded with strained smiles. Some avoided eye contact altogether. The cashier at the hardware store, someone he'd known for years, handed him change with both hands, her eyes soft, rehearsed. The look people give when they're pretending not to see a bruise. That night he sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. He thought about calling his son, about demanding to know what lies had been told. But what was the point? Michael wouldn't answer. Or worse, he would hesitant, uncertain, speaking in that careful tone people use when they're afraid the truth might shatter someone already broken. He poured himself a drink instead. The bourbon burned less than the silence. Outside wind moved through the pines. The wolves had grown quiet lately, their calls drifting farther away. The woods seemed to be watching again, waiting. He could almost feel the pulse of it in his chest nature, observing man's cruelty from a distance, unimpressed. The next blow came through the mail. A letter. No return address, but the handwriting familiar, his sister's. Short, polite, condescending. "We're worried about you," it said. "Jason told us you've been acting erratically. You're not answering calls. Please think about coming back to Denver for a while. You need help, Richard." He read it twice. Help. That word sat like ash on his tongue. He had spent his entire life helping everyone else, his son, his wife, his family, and now they were staging an intervention for a problem he didn't have. He folded the letter neatly and dropped it into the fireplace. The edges curled black as the flames took it. They wanted him to react, to prove them right, to rage, to beg, to crumble into the shape of their story. But he wouldn't. The wolves had taught him something they never could: how to survive being hunted without losing your teeth. Still, the lies worked their way in like splinters. At night he caught himself questioning his own memory. Had he really locked the shed that morning? Did he imagine the sound of a car on the road last night? Was he really being watched, or just expecting to be? Paranoia wasn't madness. It was pattern recognition after too many betrayals. He began documenting everything. Dates, times, calls. He saved voicemails, screenshots, even receipts from stores where people had looked at him strangely. It wasn't about proof for others, it was for himself, to keep his reality solid, to keep his mind from being rewritten by their version. One evening, while checking the cameras, he spotted something, a shape moving near the fence line, caught in the glare of the infrared. Too tall to be an animal. Too still to be chance. He rewound the footage and zoomed in. A man. Standing. Watching. He felt the calm come back then, the engineer's calm, cold and methodical. He copied the footage to a flash drive and tucked it into a small box in his desk. Let them call him unstable now. He had evidence. He had truth. The next morning he drove into town. He didn't go to the diner or the hardware store. He went to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk looked up, surprised but polite. "Morning, Rick. What brings you in?" "Just some footage you should see," he said, setting the flash drive down. "Someone's been trespassing on my land." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "We'll take a look. No accusations, no theatrics. Just a quiet assertion of control." He walked out of the building lighter than he'd felt in weeks. It wasn't revenge he wanted, it was acknowledgement. To remind them that silence wasn't weakness, that isolation didn't mean surrender. That night, the phone rang again. Unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. Jason's voice. "Dad," he said, too casual, too smooth. "We need to talk." The father didn't reply. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Jason continued. "People are worried. You're making this worse for yourself." He smiled faintly. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Jason paused. "I just told them the truth." "Your truth," the father said. "Not mine." "You can't isolate yourself forever," Jason snapped. "At some point, people will have to step in." The father leaned back, his voice steady. "Then they'd better step carefully." He hung up before Jason could speak again. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. He walked out onto the porch. The forest was darker than usual, the sky bruised with clouds. A storm was building somewhere far off. He felt it in his bones the way you feel pressure before rain. But fear had long since burned out of him, replaced by something harder, sharper. He wasn't fighting for a cabin anymore, or land, or even solitude. He was fighting for his name, his sanity, his truth. The kind of fight that doesn't make noise, but reshapes everything in its path. From deep in the valley, a single wolf called out low and mournful. He looked toward the sound and whispered, "I'm still here." The wind carried it back to him, faint but certain, like an echo of defiance. And for the first time he realized something simple, something absolute madness isn't when the world stops making sense. It's when people decide to make sense without you. And he would never let them write him out of his own story. The next morning the fog over the valley lifted like a curtain, and for the first time in months he saw everything clearly. The war wasn't about the wolves or the whispers. It was about control. Jason wanted to own him, not his land, not his house, but his silence. That realization hardened him in a way nothing else could. He'd played defense long enough. It was time to strike, not with rage, but with precision. He drove into town before sunrise, the sky still pale and bruised. The road curved through frost-dusted pines, his headlights carving through the mist. At the edge of town, a small law office sat tucked between a bank and a barber shop, a modest building with a wooden sign that read, "Ellis and Dunn Attorneys at Law." He'd passed it 100 times before, without a glance. Today it felt like an entrance to a different kind of battleground. Inside, the receptionist looked up, startled by the early visitor. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," he said calmly, removing his cap. "But I think you'll want to make one." They led him to the back to a man named Walter Ellis, a lawyer in his 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man who didn't waste words. The father slid a folder across the desk. Inside were printed emails, transcribed voicemails, screenshots of Jason's messages, copies of bank transfers. Each page a brick in the wall he was building. "I'm being targeted," he said, "by family. They're spreading lies to discredit me, to take my property, maybe more." Ellis flipped through the papers slowly, his brow tightening as he read. "You've documented everything." "That's what engineers do," the father replied. The lawyer looked up, intrigued. "And what exactly do you want to do about it?" He leaned back in his chair, voice steady. "I want to make sure they can't touch what's mine. And I want every lie they've told to choke them legally." By noon they had a plan. A revocable living trust. Simple, airtight, indestructible. It would move every asset, the cabin, the land, the savings, out of his personal name and into the trust, making it legally untouchable. If Jason and his circle tried to claim he was unfit or unstable, they'd find nothing left to claim. Ellis drafted the documents, explaining each clause in quiet detail. The father listened carefully, his mind sharp and disciplined. He made adjustments, suggested protections even the lawyer hadn't considered. He wasn't just defending himself now. He was designing an outcome. Before leaving, Ellis handed him a thin envelope. "I'll file everything by Friday," he said. "But if they push harder, I can prepare a cease and desist." These messages alone could qualify as defamation. The father nodded, pocketing the envelope. "Don't worry about me," he said, standing. "I've got my part handled." As he stepped outside, the wind hit his face sharp and cold. It didn't sting, it woke him up. For the first time in months, the anxiety that had clung to him like smoke was gone. He wasn't the hunted anymore. He was the architect. That evening he sat at his desk and began organizing the rest of his records. Old utility bills, mortgage statements, his wife's insurance policies, letters from his son, every document went into labeled folders. He built the archive like a blueprint, layer by layer, structure upon structure. Each piece told the same story, a man of order, logic, and precision. Not the picture Jason had painted, but the truth he could prove. By midnight, he'd scanned every file onto an encrypted drive, stored copies in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboard, and sent digital duplicates to his attorney. The system was perfect, self-sustaining, unassailable. The next morning, Jason called again. He didn't answer. The voicemail came through anyway. "Dad, this has gone too far. We just want to make sure you're safe. People are worried. You can't keep hiding behind paperwork." He played the message twice, then archived it. Evidence. Every lie disguised as concern. Every manipulation wrapped in guilt. He wasn't angry anymore. He was collecting. Later that week, Ellis called to confirm the trust was officially active. The cabin now belonged to a legal entity, one with no emotion, no vulnerability, no fear. He smiled as he signed the final page, his signature steady as a steel beam. When he returned home, he found a new letter in the mailbox, this time from his sister. Again softer in tone, but sharper between the lines. "Jason says you're cutting everyone off. That's not healthy. We're considering petitioning for guardianship if you don't cooperate." Guardianship. The word pulsed like a warning siren. That was Jason's next move, to have him declared incompetent, to strip him of rights under the guise of protection. He almost laughed. The irony was perfect. The only way they could steal his life was to pretend they were saving it. He walked into the study, pulled the latest documents from his drawer, and set them neatly beside the fire. The trust made their plan impossible. If they filed for guardianship, they'd find an empty vault. Legally, the man they wanted to control owned nothing. The property belonged to his creation. The engineer had built his final masterpiece, a fortress made of paper and precision. He poured himself a drink, letting the bourbon trace heat through his chest. The fireplace flickered, painting the room in golden shadow. The phone rang again. He ignored it. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley, low and steady. The storm was moving closer, and he could almost sense the shape of Jason's next attack, a confrontation, a desperate move, maybe even a visit. Let him come, he thought. Let him stand in front of this cabin and realize he's already lost. He turned to his notebook, the one filled with every step of his plan. Under Phase 2, he drew a single check mark. Then beneath it, he wrote, "They wanted madness. I gave them method." Outside, the sky split open, with lightning illuminating the fence line for a single perfect second. The rain began to fall, rhythmic and relentless, tapping against the windows like clockwork. He watched it for a while, calm, certain. Age hadn't weakened him. It had refined him. The years had stripped away sentiment and left only clarity, the kind of clarity that turned wisdom into weaponry. As the storm deepened, he whispered to the empty room, "Let them test me now." Somewhere in the woods, the wolves stirred again, their calls distant but rising. Not warning, not threat, a signal. The forest, like the law, had its own way of restoring balance. And now both were on his side. He found out by accident, which somehow made it worse. There was no confession, no apology, no tearful explanation, just a trail of numbers that didn't lie. His son had come to the cabin after weeks of silence, pale, exhausted, carrying a stack of bank statements in his shaking hands. He didn't even knock. He just walked in eyes wide with something between disbelief and collapse. "Dad," he said, voice cracking. "You need to see this." The father studied him quietly. There were deep shadows under the boy's eyes, the kind that come from nights without sleep. He'd aged 10 years since their last argument. The father gestured toward the table. "Sit down," he said. "Start from the beginning." The son spread the papers out like evidence. Withdrawals, transfers, gambling accounts. Thousands gone. Tens of thousands. He pointed to one transaction. She said it was for a renovation. Then she said it was an investment. I didn't question it, why would I? He laughed bitterly. Turns out it went to a betting site. The father didn't react. Not yet. He just listened. His hands stayed folded steady. "And it gets worse," the son continued. "She told people you'd been giving her money behind my back, that you didn't trust me with finances. She used your name to open a line of credit." The father's eyes darkened. "How much?" "Nearly 40 grand, the son whispered. Silence filled the room like static. Outside wind moved through the pines, scraping against the window panes. The father leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless. Inside, though, something was shifting, a slow, seismic grief, old and familiar. He had built his life around two constants, work and family. The work had rewarded him. The family had broken him twice now, first with betrayal, then with blindness. The son rubbed his face, his voice breaking. "She said you were crazy, that you were paranoid, that you were trying to ruin us." I believed her, Dad. I believed every word. There it was. The wound beneath the wound. Not just the lie, but who chose to believe it. The father exhaled slowly, measured. "You believed because you wanted to," he said, not unkindly. "You wanted peace more than truth. That's how men like her survive." The son's shoulders trembled. "I thought I was protecting her." "You were protecting the illusion," the father said. "The kind that keeps decent people asleep while the selfish ones feed." The words weren't meant to punish. They were facts spoken like a diagnosis. But they landed heavy. The son's face collapsed into his hands, tears spilling through his fingers. "I ruined everything," he said. "I let her turn me against you." The father stood slow but certain. He walked to the window, looking out toward the woods where the wolves had once gathered. Their howls had faded with the season replaced by snow and silence. "You didn't ruin it," he said. "You just let her write the story for a while. Now it's your turn to take the pen back." The son looked up, confusion flickering through the grief. "You're not angry. I've been angry for months," the father said quietly. "Now I'm something else awake." They sat in silence. The only sound the creak of the cabin as the temperature dropped outside. The father poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of his son. The younger man's hands shook as he took it. "She's gone," he said finally. "Packed her things and left this morning. No note. Just gone." "She'll be back," the father said, sipping. "People like her always come back when the lies stop working. They need new ones to live off." The son stared at him. "How do you stay calm after everything she did?" The father gave a faint, tired smile. "Because I've seen what panic does. Panic builds traps. Calm builds exits." The words seemed to settle into the air, heavy and grounding. The son nodded slowly, his breathing evening out. "I want to fix this," he said. "Whatever it takes." "Then start by knowing the difference between guilt and responsibility," the father said. "You can't fix her, but you can repair what you let her touch." They worked in silence for hours. The father showed him how to trace each transaction, how to flag evidence for the lawyer, how to file an affidavit. The son followed every instruction, his movements stiff but focused. As they worked, the weight between them shifted, less blame, more resolve. When they finished, the sun had gone down. The room glowed with the light of the fire, the papers stacked neatly in a folder on the table. The son stared at it like it was both a weapon and a confession. "You kept everything organized," he said quietly. You always did. It's how you survive lies, the father said. You build structure where chaos wants to live. The son hesitated, then asked, "What happens now?" Now the father looked toward the window where snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. Now she answers for what she took. And you remember who taught you to be honest before she taught you to doubt it. The younger man's jaw tightened. She'll say I drove her away, that I'm lying. Then let her, the father replied. The truth doesn't need believers. It just needs time. Outside, the forest grew darker, the sound of wind deepening into a low moan. The wolves would not return this season, but their lesson remained patience before precision, silence before strike. He saw it now, not just in himself, but in his son. The fear had burned away, leaving something clearer, raw. For the first time, the son looked older, not beaten but tempered. I'm sorry, Dad, he said quietly. The father shook his head. Don't be sorry. Be better. The fire crackled and the two men sat in its glow, the distance between them closing in quiet increments. No dramatic forgiveness, no speeches. Just two people who finally saw the same truth after too long in the dark. Later that night, after his son had gone to bed in the guest room, the father stood outside under the stars. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The world was cold, sharp, and honest again. He breathed in the air clean, unfiltered, and felt something close to peace, though not the gentle kind. The kind that comes after surviving a war you didn't start. Inside the cabin, the folder of evidence sat on the table beside his notebook. He picked up the pencil and wrote a single line beneath his last note. Sometimes truth doesn't set you free. It makes you strong enough to stand chained to it without flinching. He looked toward the window where his son's light still glowed faintly and whispered to himself, he finally sees it. But even as that fragile peace settled, he knew this wasn't the end. Lies never die cleanly, they come back desperate for air. And when she did, she'd find two men waiting this time, not broken, not fooled, unforgiving. By spring, the storm had passed quietly, decisively, as if the land itself had grown tired of chaos. The courts did what nature always promised, restored balance. The in-laws who had schemed, lied, and manipulated finally faced the weight of their own creation. Perjury, fraud, defamation, each charge a brick laid in the wall of their undoing. Their polished arrogance cracked under cross-examination, their stories collapsing like cheap scaffolding in a gale. When the verdict came, it wasn't dramatic. It was clean. They were ordered to repay what they'd taken, to issue public apologies, to vanish from the very circle they had tried to control. The father didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't need to. Justice didn't require witnesses, it required patience. He had learned that the way the forest learns, winter, slow, inevitable, permanent. Instead, he stayed at the cabin, sitting by the window with a mug of black coffee, watching snowmelt carve silver veins into the earth. The wolves had moved north for the season, the air softer now, the ground thawing. A truck pulled up the drive one afternoon, a familiar sound this time. His son stepped out, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, face leaner, steadier. No hesitation, no shame. Just presence. Got the papers finalized, he said. The divorce was done. The lies were over. The father nodded, not in celebration, but acknowledgement. You did what you had to. His son smiled faintly. Guess I learned from the best. They worked together that day, fixing the porch railing, patching the roof where winter had chewed through the shingles. No speeches, no apologies. Just the rhythm of nails, hammers, and quiet reconciliation. When evening came, they grilled venison and ate on the porch. Elk grazed in the distance, slow and deliberate under the orange wash of sunset. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. The son broke it first. You ever think about leaving here? The father shook his head. No, this is where the noise stops. His son leaned back, watching the sky fade into indigo. Then I'll stay close. Found a small place in town 5 miles out. Close enough to help. far enough to breathe. The father's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice stayed calm. "You don't owe me anything, son." "I know," the young man said, "but maybe I owe myself a chance to do things right this time." For a long time, neither spoke. The crickets had begun their chorus, and the air smelled of cedar and distant rain. The father looked toward the tree line where the wolves once prowled, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "Funny thing about predators," he said softly. "They don't hold grudges. They just move on, once balance is restored." His son followed his gaze. "Guess we're both learning from the wild." The father chuckled low and warm. "Took me a lifetime to listen." Inside the cabin the fire crackled. On the mantel sat the old photograph of his wife, restored, framed properly now. Not a shrine, not a wound, just memory. The home felt full again, not of people but of presence. Everything had a place. The ghosts had gone quiet. In the months that followed, peace settled over him like a second skin. The phone rang less, the letters stopped coming. The trust he had built held firm, untouched. The lawyer sent updates, occasionally short, factual, final. Every legal knot that once threatened to strangle him now unraveled cleanly under the weight of truth. He spent his mornings walking the trail down to the creek, the same one he'd built years ago when he first bought the land. The water ran clear again, free of ice. Sometimes he'd catch sight of a single wolf track in the mud, one print deep and certain, then gone. He took it as a sign, though he couldn't have said of what. In the evenings his son would visit. They'd talk about small things, weather repairs, fishing spots. They didn't need to revisit the past. It had already done its work. The damage had turned to understanding. The pain had hardened into wisdom. The father saw it in his son's posture now, in the steadiness of his voice. One night as they sat on the porch watching the elk graze, the son said quietly, "You were right about everything." The father smiled faintly. "No, I was just patient enough to let everything prove itself." The younger man laughed under his breath. "Patience isn't exactly my strong suit." "Then learn it," the father said. "It's the only weapon that doesn't rust." A breeze rolled through the valley, bending the grass in slow waves. The sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in copper and blood-orange streaks. The world looked clean, earned, alive again. When the sun finally left that night, the father stayed outside, rocking slowly in his chair. The wood creaked, the air smelled of pine sap and smoke. He looked out at the land, his land untouched, unbought, unbroken. Every board of the cabin, every acre of soil was a testament to endurance. For years they had called him stubborn, crazy, paranoid. But as the stars blinked awake above the treetops, he understood the truth that had carried him through every trial. Stubbornness is what the wise call perseverance before it's proven right. He closed his eyes, listening to the night. Somewhere far off an elk called low, peaceful, eternal. He smiled. He had not won through anger. He had not destroyed to triumph. He had endured, and that was enough. The phone lay on the table beside him, silent. The paperwork was done, the records sealed, the accounts restored. He had nothing left to fight, nothing left to prove. Only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built his peace board by board, word by word, truth by truth. He raised his glass of bourbon toward the darkening woods, the gesture small but certain. "To patience," he murmured. "To balance." The wind moved through the trees like an answer, soft, approving, infinite. And as the last light bled from the sky, the old man closed his eyes, the sound of the elk and the distant creek merging into a single perfect rhythm. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't roar or strike or boast. It simply endured, like the mountain, like the wolves, like the man who had outlasted them all. The porch rocked steady as a heartbeat, and for the first time in years he knew peace wasn't something you found. It was something you earned by refusing to let the world turn you cruel. Life has a way of testing what we value most, not through battles of strength, but through moments that demand patience, dignity, and quiet resolve. This story reminds us that wisdom is not weakness. It's power refined by time. The father didn't win by shouting or fighting back in anger. He won by standing still when the world tried to shake him, by trusting that truth always finds its way through the noise. For older generations, it's a powerful lesson. Peace doesn't mean surrender, and calm doesn't mean you've lost your edge. It means you've learned the difference between reacting and responding, between revenge and justice. When others underestimate your silence, they forget that it takes a lifetime of endurance to earn it. So take heart. Your patience, your experience, and your quiet strength are not relics of the past. They are tools of survival in a loud and reckless world. If this story spoke to your heart, subscribe to the channel for more powerful revenge stories that honor wisdom, justice, and dignity. And share your thoughts in the comments. What life lesson took you the longest to learn?